Hello and welcome to Bitcoin with Jake. Today I've got Greg Foss. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
Absolute pleasure. I'm very excited to hear your story. I always start in the same way. So could we hear a little bit about the projects you're involved in today? So we have an overview of where we're at as of now. And then what I like to do is dig around in how we got to today. So a bit about yourself just in the present moment, please.
The present moment. So I'm 58 years old. I'm fat. I've spent 30 years, we'll get to this, but it's important. I'm a veteran of 30 years of trading in the credit markets. In 2016, I hit the wall in that after managing people's money for that long, under the pressures that you're under, I had to put my hand up to retire from the hedge fund. Our hedge fund had just been bought. So I'm sort of jumping back a couple of years, but it's important to understand that in 2016-ish, I was a wreck, a mental wreck. My trading career had been quite successful. I'm not trying to brag, but it's like an addiction. You have to always outperform the year before, and you got to do bigger and better. And managing people's money is a tough slog, but we'll get into that. Anyway, I put my hand up to retire for many reasons, most of which is I was literally suicidal in my life. I had the pressures of managing people's money. Anxiety and depression are quite closely linked, whether you know that or not. But I needed to survive, and I had gone down a very deep decline. So I retired in 2016, and I'm still retired. All right. But that being said, I've never been more busy in my life. I was lucky to recover from the mental health challenges. It wasn't easy. It took a couple of years. Dragged my family through some pretty deep, swamp. But they stuck with me. I'm blessed, and I have 3 kids, a nice, beautiful wife, and a pretty good family. Pretty good situation. But I'm 58 years old, and one of the things I was depressed about was the fiat system, the fiat world that I'd lived in for the last 30 years. And anyway, I found Bitcoin. And while I'm not employed by anybody officially, I do a lot of podcasts. I'm also involved in a very, very cool company in Canada called Validus Power, where we own 400 megawatts of power off the grid or behind the meter. We actually own the power plants. They're natural gas fired generators that we use to mine Bitcoin. We host, and we also self-mine. We're doing some extremely exciting stuff, including pumping lake water from a lake that's in Canada called Lake Ontario. It's one of the deepest Great Lakes, in that you can get water from 90 meters below the surface, a couple of 100 yards out from the lake. It actually goes down to 700 feet deep, almost, as you know, you measure that in a couple of 100 meters deep. But anyway, 90 meters deep, 4 degrees Celsius water you run through your Bitcoin miners, called hydro mining. It makes them so efficient that you can increase the efficacy of your mine. Of your Bitcoin mine, and use less power, or use the same amount of power and double the amount of hash power in the miner, etc. That being said, again, I'm not an employee. I'm an investor and a strategic advisor to the company, because they are power experts, and I've spent my life since 2016 studying Bitcoin. I believe Bitcoin is the most beautiful technology I've ever experienced in my life. From a financial perspective. And more importantly, it's also the best asymmetric investment opportunity I've ever seen, in that Bitcoin at its current trading price is a fraction of its true value. And I think that everybody needs exposure to Bitcoin, because most people do not understand the fiat Ponzi that we actually live in. And my experience for 30 years has been living in the fiat Ponzi. So we'll get to that. But I am, I'm passionate about Bitcoin, like you said you were. Obsessed is your words about describing you. I'm not certain I'm that crazy about it, although I love you for being obsessed with it. I need the Bitcoin solution to solve the fiat Ponzi because I have 3 kids and we have some drunk drivers who are at the wheel of the global economy, whether they be central bankers or they be politicians who try and influence things via things like deficit spending and whatnot. We're in bad shape. I'm a Canadian, G7 country. I want the future for my children to be as open and bright as when I was born into this world. And right now it's not, because in the case of Canada, I think we have a prime minister who is an absolute buffoon. He has admitted he's very poor at math. Well, you can't be poor at math and run a global economic superpower like Canada. He's made statements like the budget will balance itself. Well, budgets don't balance themselves. That's the statement coming from a spoiled kid whose daddy always paid his credit card. And so I feel the need to get out and tell my story. And I think I've lived a fairly specific or, unique existence, that my story is different from everybody else because, I can go back 30 years and tell you why I was looking for the solution to the fiat Ponzi, but there wasn't that solution until I discovered it. It was in 2016. It was 7 years into, 6 or 7 years into the birth of the Bitcoin blockchain, but still I've been studying it for the last 6 years. I'm dedicated to trying to help people understand how beautiful it is, and that it can change your generational wealth. It can help impoverished countries break out of the fiat Ponzi that up until now has always been disadvantageous to them. So that's where I am. Partial educator. You and I were introduced to a friend called named Daz Bea. Daz and I work in the Looking Glass Education .com. We are partners in that free education platform. So, I do a bunch of different stuff. I like not being paid, because that way I can just say, that's it, I'm going skiing. Okay. Like I want to be skiing. I don't have to report to someone who says, I'm paying your salary, you're not able to go skiing. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. Excuse me. Well, Greg, so much to dive into. I love it. Thank you for sharing all of that.
Yeah.
So much of what happens in the present day is informed by what happened in the past.
Yes.
And you've mentioned a number of things here that I'd love to ask you about, but we'll try and move to that later in the conversation, and I'll draw it back to some of the things you touched upon. You spent 30 years trading risk.
Yes,
what
sir.
does that mean? So, presumably you went to a high school somewhere, you took some kind of university degree. Were you always interested in going into financial markets? And like to the person that's never heard the phrase trading risk, like, can you give us a little summary as to what that looks like and how you got into that position?
Yeah. So, it's a great question. Thank you. I grew up in Montreal. I played sports quite seriously as a kid. I was never that good, but I took it seriously. I went to university at McGill, which is a world-renowned university. I was smart enough to get into their engineering program, but to be very honest, I went there to play sports. And after about 2 weeks in engineering, I knew I didn't really want to be an engineer. I love the mathematics of it, but man, oh man, there was different stuff I wanted to do in life. Anyway, 2 weeks turned into 2 months, turned into 2 years, turned into a 4-year degree. And I ended up graduating. And when my sports career was over, I'm like, what the heck am I going to do now? I don't want to be an engineer. And that being said, it's not a bad career to have, but I knew from day one that it wasn't quite my cup of tea. And so I lived in a fraternity with a bunch of other guys, and it just so happened that one of my buddies was studying for the GMAT, which is a graduate management admission test for North American. I don't even know if they have it in Australia or whatever, but it doesn't matter. It's a standardized test for acceptance into business programs in North America. And so he was studying for it. I said, "Hey, Grant, what the heck are you doing?" He goes, "I'm studying for GMAT acceptance." I go, "For what? Acceptance to what?" He says, "An MBA program." I go, "Master's of Business Administration." Okay. Yeah, why don't I try and take that with you? Because I think that I would like to have the opportunity of going outside of engineering. So one of the reasons I didn't switch immediately into engineering in let's say second year back to business is because you can never do the flip side. You can never go from business back into engineering, because all the credits that you get from business, none of them apply to your engineering degree. So anyway, the 4 years happened. I write this MBA application, or this test, and I actually ended up doing quite well on it. We studied hard, but I got a decent mark, quite a decent mark. And I didn't have much money in the bank, but I applied to 3 Canadian universities, and I had enough money to apply to 1 US university. And it turned out, like everything happens for a reason, I applied to Cornell University in upstate New York, which is about a 5-hour drive from Montreal, where McGill is as well. And I was still living in Montreal at the time. And lo and behold, I, as a Canadian, got accepted at Cornell University. And it was very lucky, because I would not have been accepted as an American applying to Cornell University. My marks were good enough. My GMAT, Graduate Management Admission test, was good enough. What I did not have is work experience, because generally they want you to get work experience. But since they were trying to build an international business program at Cornell, the fact that I checked the box as a foreigner with good marks and a GMAT, good marks from McGill University, I got in, and I was pretty lucky. And so I'm pretty spiritual as well, looking back on this. Spiritual, not that religious, but very spiritual. There was a reason I got into Cornell. I got to live with some really cool undergraduate USA students from various parts of the world. You realize the difference in our cultural upbringing. A sad aside, one of my roommates was killed in the September 11th or September 9/11. So September 11th, 2001. He died in the World Trade Center. But so I've lived some of the American horrendous experiences. I understand the difference with their culture versus Canadian. And even though Canada is so close to the United States, we are markedly different in a number of ways. Anyway, very valuable experience there. So graduate after 2 years, which is essentially 6 years straight of university, right? I didn't have the work experience in between it. Loved Cornell, had an opportunity to work on Wall Street in New York. But you know what? I said, I want to come back to Canada. I just feel like there's something I can accomplish in Canada. And I got a pretty good job as one of a team member of Canada's largest bank, called Royal Bank of Canada. Largest bank is measured by assets, which in commercial banking is the number of loans that bank makes. So as measured by assets, Canada's largest financial institution, I got hired in a special project group, and I was working directly for the CFO of the Royal Bank of Canada. And this was in 1988. And my first serious project was to determine which Brady plan option that the Royal Bank of Canada needed to take to solve its Latin American, or the first portion of its Latin American debt crisis, otherwise known as LDC, lesser developed country debt, the Mexican portion. And so this was 1988. And I'm like, okay, well, I better look at the whole bank portfolio and see how much total Latin American debt we owned. And the numbers seem minuscule in today's day and age of $1 trillion this, $1 trillion that. The Royal Bank of Canada only had $4 billion of Latin American or lesser developed country debt exposure, to be exact. Most of it was to Latin American. We had about $1 billion to Mexico, $1 billion to Brazil, another $1 billion to other Latin American countries. And then the balance, the last billion, was spread around, let's say, Vietnam, Thailand, all these countries. There's 44 in total, lesser developed countries. But the first one they wanted to solve was the Mexican debt situation. So I said, okay, well, let me look at this portfolio, $4 billion of debt. The average trading price in the secondary markets for this debt, and strangely, they all traded almost at the same price because the liquidity was very poor, but nonetheless, the average trading price was about 25 cents on the dollar, which meant Royal Bank of Canada had $4 billion of this debt. and it needed to write down the value of this debt. Let's say it was a trading position and you were a trader. You would have to write down that value of the debt, which was on the bank's books at 100 cents on the dollar. You'd have to write it down to 25 cents on the dollar, which means you have to take a write-off of 75 cents on the dollar on $4 billion worth of debt, right? You follow me with that? That's pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
You need to write down $3 billion. Now, in the banking system, you write down your loan losses against your book value of equity. So I flipped to the financial statements of the book value of equity, and lo and behold, Royal Bank's book value of equity was less than $3 billion. The amount of write-off is technical term. Royal Bank of Canada was insolvent. And I'm like, what the absolute hell? I just went through 6 years of school, came back to Canada's largest financial institution, and it's on its way to bankruptcy. So I go to the CFO and I say, like, this is 1988, and I'm a kid straight out of high school, not high school, but straight out of school. Emil, we have a big problem. He goes, I know, don't tell anybody. I'm like, what? Don't tell anybody. This is Canada's largest financial institution. Millions of Canadians have their deposits entrusted in the Royal Bank of Canada. And we're not supposed to tell anybody. Now, so, okay, look, I played part of the team. I'm like, what am I going to do anyway? I'm 20 something years old. I'm going to run to the Wall Street Journal and say to the Wall Street Journal that the entire banking system is bankrupt. And by the way, it wasn't, just Royal Bank of Canada that was in that shape. It was all money center banks in the US, European global banks as well. They had all taken petrodollar proceeds from the Middle East and invested it or rolled it into Latin American debt exposure at higher rates than they would receive. Problem is they were US dollar based loans. And when the US dollar strengthened, the foreign exchange made these loans excessive to service, and all the countries defaulted. So Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady of the United States at the time came up with an ingenious plan to basically switch a 5-year loan, defaulted loan, into a 30-year obligation that was still Mexican risk, but it was backed by US Treasury zero coupon debt that over time, if you're familiar with what happens with a zero coupon bond, it does not pay an interest coupon. It's the principal value of that bond will accrete over time. In a 30-year period, it would have accreted from a price of about 17 cents on the dollar all the way back to par over a 30-year period, which meant of the 25 cents, 17 of it gets backed by US Treasury debt, okay? And then the balance, which is Mexican risk, basically you hope that this restructuring and reduction in debt burden for Mexico allows Mexico to become a higher credit, and everything skates on side. And it was a brilliant solution. It was accounting gimmickry by and large, because you change a 5-year loan into a 30-year loan, and you don't have to write it down because the account, excuse me.
That's right.
My political said a political party. It's probably they were listening to me on this podcast, and it was Pierre Trudeau calling me. So go fuck yourself, Justin Trudeau. So anyway, so here's what, it was a brilliant accounting solution, but it was gimmickry. Okay. And nonetheless, Royal Bank of Canada, we picked the solution that, because of changes in interest rates and everything, the $1 billion of debt, we picked one that was worth 2% more than the competing option, but 2% on $1 billion. Okay, you guys know that is essentially $20 million of profit for the Royal Bank of Canada. And I'm pretty psyched that Goldman Sachs confirmed that I did the right choice. And, I said to my boss, let's go and buy more of this, right? This looks like a pretty good investment option now. Of course, what do banks do? They're like, nah, we blew our brains out at 100 cents on the dollar. Why would we buy any more at 25 cents on the dollar? Well, those bonds actually went from 25 cents on the dollar because of changes in interest rates and et cetera. They went to $140 per $100 bond. Okay. It was a great restructuring, skated the banks on side, but none of the Canadian banks bought any more of the debt because they had blown their brains out at 100 cents on the dollar, right? Typical bankers. Anyway, I still, to this day, am sick to my stomach over the fact that the fiat Ponzi existed in 1988, and I didn't tell any newspapers about it. And I had student loans that I needed to pay, and I didn't want to torpedo my career in finance by running as a whistleblower to the newspapers. So that was 1988. I became a credit trader, and since becoming a full-time professional credit trader, working for both the sell side of the street and the buy side being working at two separate hedge funds, I've lived through 4 financial crises. First one I mentioned, Latin American debt. The second one, long-term capital management in 1998. The third one was the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. That was the real deal. The world was ending. It was incredibly scary. But then the most recent one, which was the COVID crisis. 4 of these crises, each one more severe than the past in terms of the amount of debt required or amount of restructuring required to bail out the global economy. Essentially what happens over those 4 events is the transfer of risk from the financial system, Jake, to the balance sheets of the central banks. And it's like crony capitalism. You are not punishing the players on Wall Street for making horrible risk decisions, and you're bailing them out. And this type of result leads to a future financial crisis, which is more severe than the last one. Okay, and you can see in terms of the volumes of the bailouts required in each successive financial crisis, it's more severe. In some cases, the steepness of the decline and the snapback is faster because the central government bank goes, well, we don't have any choice. So we're going to have to bail this out. So we might as well do it immediately rather than letting markets flush out the zombie companies, et cetera, et cetera. So right now we are in a fiat Ponzi that's accelerated since 1988. Luckily in 2016, I mentioned I found Bitcoin, and have been studying it ever since. And it gives me hope that there is an alternative to the fiat system, which is so dangerous for the future of our children.
Wow, it's a fascinating insight. I mean, if I could summarize, I mean, a genuine industry insider. You know, you've seen these companies behave,
Yes.
You've seen central banks behave. It's a kind of confluence of these hugely powerful organizations that, you know, say that they're working on behalf of the people in terms of the government, or a bank that holds
Correct.
people's deposits are taking perhaps undue risk or whatever the case might be. And no one's even talking about it.
Well, they don't, because a lot of people don't understand, right? And this is sort of the genesis for our Looking Glass education platform, because they won't teach you this in school, Jake. They can't, right? Even in finance classes, they cannot teach you that the banking system is on the edge of a pin, okay? Because the banking system is leveraged so highly that on a regular basis, banks and the global banking system becomes insolvent. Essentially, a bank only holds $6 of risk absorbing equity capital for every $100 of loans that it makes, which means the other $94 comes from depositors' money. Now, tell me there aren't times over a cycle where the value of that loan declines by more than 6%. Like, I can tell you just by the widening of credit spreads in peripheral markets that if you have high yield debt that's widening, I guarantee you the loan spread is widening as well. It doesn't mean the bank is selling it. It just means that's where risk is priced. And as a credit trader, I say this a ton of times, credit is the dog and equity is the tail. And most equity buffoons have no clue which is going on in the credit markets, yet equity, everyone says, oh, these guys know everything. They don't, all right? Credit markets are the ones that know everything. Credit markets are 4 times as large as the equity markets, and they have a prior claim on the assets of a company. Don't you think you should figure out what's going on in the much larger market for risk evaluation? And it has a prior claim on the capital structure. Unless the debt of a company is worth 100 cents on the dollar, the equity of that same company is worth zero. Okay, that's the priority of claim that takes place in a capital structure in the event of a restructuring or a default. Don't mess with that, okay? Because the credit guides are vicious. And having sat in that chair, I would stuff the stupid equity guys' mouths with their own stock on a short sale basis, because if I owned a bond that I was concerned wouldn't get 100 cents back on the dollar, these guys are getting nothing. And you can do it through put options, you can do it through derivative contracts, CDS, et cetera, just sell the subordinate claim if you are concerned that the senior claim is going to be compromised in any way.
Wow, it's so interesting. It's not the kind of thing that, as you mentioned already, is talked about openly, and hence one of my, one of the passions behind starting this podcast is talking to people like yourself, understanding what is going on in the world from people that have sat in positions where they physically experienced it. Like you are. Yes. Essentially a walking, talking piece of primary research for how this actually works.
Thank you for saying that, but it's true because, like, again, we have a lot of guys. Now, look, you're 30 something, and there's a lot of kids that are
so I was actually born in 1988 that you mentioned.
Okay, so isn't that something that I have been working for as long as you've been alive, okay? Yeah. In the financial pits, okay? Like, no disrespect to people who are 24, but they don't know shit, okay? They just don't. You don't learn it in school. You may learn it, but if you started even working when you were 12 years old and you're now 24 years old and you were able to get a job where you actually understood financial markets when you're age 12, which is to say you're not getting that job, you've only been working for 12 years. Like, you don't know anything until you've lived through a full financial cycle. And typically the financial cycles are 10 years in duration. Okay. So, here's a tidbit of information for you. I talked about starting my career in the Latin American debt restructuring. So Argentina is a G20 country, and it has defaulted 4 times in my career. Okay,
wow.
4, and that's to say that Argentina issues 30-year bonds, but there's never been a 30-year bond that has matured in the history of my career from Argentina, because the country has defaulted 4 times. All right. Wow. It's a G20 country. We're not talking about some little, periphery country that's got, this is a G20 country. So, it's real. It's very painful for the citizens of Argentina, but it happens on a regular basis, and it just seems to get shuffled under the rug. Your country.
We don't ask why. We don't say, oh, well, hang on, why is this happening? And it's actually where I see, just from a digital product perspective, we used to talk a lot about product market fit. And you're like, you need to find product market fit before your digital product takes off. You're basically looking for that traction moment. And Bitcoin actually is proving to have product market fit in places where it's most needed. So I grew up in the UK, I live in Australia, you're based in Canada, worked in the States or university in the States. Yep. Your financial privilege is the best in the world, right?
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily understand what it feels like to have hyperinflation. So I previously had Katie, the Russian, on here a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about living in Russia and growing up as a teenager. She's great. She's like, she lived through a hyperinflation.
Right.
And one of my favorite podcasts this is an old recording I found back in 2015. Winston Cesares talking about life in
isn't that
Argentina.
Crazy in the Patagonia? Yeah, Patagonia, right?
Go,
yeah.
Whoa, that's an
incredible podcast.
Right, and this is why I love these stories. They're so incredible. And you're like, okay, cool. Well, let's start digging in why, and then it makes the lens on Bitcoin that much more interesting. But before we dive into that, Greg, I'm intrigued. Sure. You mentioned that you were very passionate about sport as a younger man.
Yes.
And you got sidetracked into basically, improving your education and getting into the financial industry.
I was lucky, man. I was not a great player, but at the end of the day,
well, what sport were you playing?
I was North American football. So
okay, awesome.
Yeah, but I was a walk-on, but I played for 4 years, and And there's no scholarships in Canada anyway, in university sports. It's not like the USA where you, but that being said, it helps if you get into the school. Let's say you have a football coach that's helping you, hey, can you open this door? Now I'm going to look back and say I didn't need it. I wasn't good enough for the coaches to bend any rules to get me into the school, but I was there at a top engineering school playing football that took at least 20 hours a week, start to finish, of your time. So it added to the stresses of of an engineering career. And, you learn a lot about yourself. You learn about a lot about commitment, time management, dedication, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, that's, but
well,
again,
and that's what I was kind of leading to, like the characteristics of someone who's really passionate about sport. It's interesting how they translate into their business career. And that's kind of what I'm trying to go next is,
okay.
As an industry insider, what was it like? I mean, we'll get to this in a second, I think, but it's super competitive. I imagine the credit trading market that you worked in. So
it's a zero-sum game.
Did being passionate about sport lead into that, or did it help you when you're in that scenario? And teach us a bit about what it's actually like. You're sitting and you come into work, like what does a day feel like?
So, thank you for the question. When you're young, it's really exciting, okay? And the way I would describe it to anyone who wanted to know is I'd say, that feeling in your stomach when you have a big sporting event coming up and you're just, it has butterflies in your stomach, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that. Well, I felt like that every single day because you're sitting on trading positions that define what sort of bonus you're going to get at the end of the year. And let's say you're trying to improve your life and buy a house and, be a big swinger, and most bond traders blow up after, within 6 years. And I basically did it for 5 times the average. This is really fun until it becomes a way of life and it becomes an addiction, and you always have to do better than you did last year, and you can't control the markets, but you pretend you can. And anyway, it ended up almost killing me. I already mentioned that.
Yeah.
You need to understand that the pressures in that chair are very real. Nobody can experience it unless you've sat in that chair. So I have often saying, you have the head of the Federal Reserve, the most important risk chair in the world, who is a lawyer, who's ever not actually ever sat in a true risk chair to manage risk. Okay. He's an academic. If he is, he listens to other academics that have never sat in these risk chairs and seeing how quickly markets can unwind and unravel. And it really bums me out in that we are basically taking direction from a lawyer, and he's making decisions that, look, anyone who believes that modern monetary theory is not to blame for the current inflationary environment that we are in right now, failed mathematics. They're, past the pipe, okay? You're smoking hookah, you got the glue bag on your head, you're listening to an idiot professor named Stephanie Kelton, who's also never sat in a risk chair. So you got to call the truth when you see it. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I love it. It's so important because we're all being lied to. It's super simple. Oh, inflation.
Some people are lying to us and some people don't know any better,
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of me is hesitant to, scream conspiracy from the rooftops and say,
right,
oh, this is all a big plan to like fuck us over and take our money and our private property, etc. It might be, but equally, humans make mistakes all the time, and the societies that we live in today are an amalgamation of everything that's happened in history. The different political moments where people, women get to vote, or
yes,
so much of this has been fought for in the past, that at the time was a big change. And we're just at another one of those moments in history where, we don't know where we're going to end up. But it's extraordinary how, having fallen down the Bitcoin rabbit hole much harder just in recent years. And I mean, I bought some in 2015. I sold a load in 2016 and 2017 for silly reasons. And then held, and then suddenly, the the 6 trillion kind of, quantitative easing
Yes.
program kicks off, and you're like, whoa, what just happened? And
Yeah.
I then saw MicroStrategy and Sailor's Move, and you're like, hang on, that's interesting. A stock listed company with a team of lawyers and a team of accountants has just put it on their balance sheet for the first time. I really probably should take another look at this. And like many of us, I guess, the last 24 months is just, that speed down the hole has just sped up. But you think to yourself, okay, why do all these people think so differently around you? I go to the local market and I ask the butcher, have your prices gone up? And they say, yeah, they've gone up. Why have they gone up? Oh, supply chain this and supply chain that. Now, that might be true in the case of Australia and what happened with the lockdowns and getting stuff in and out of the country to some degree. But of the, let's say, 90 people I ask, 100 people I ask, a handful of them will say modern monetary theory is causing inflation.
Right.
Basically, everyone will have some other reason for it that's not connected to what you believe.
Putin, that's the latest one.
Yeah.
Putin,
Fucking Vladimir's got us all like,
yeah. But anyway, the people that know better, and this is part of the process, and it's guys like Daz Baya, who, another thing about kids that played competitive sports when they were young is they typically don't take shit that as well as people who are just, okay, go sit in the corner and let me tell you what to do, right? And, Daz is one of those guys, always asking like, well, what if that is not the narrative that's the truth? And I'm not saying that people outright lie to you. There are definitely people that don't know any better, but there are scary things that are happening in our world. And luckily, there's still freedom of speech in both of our countries, although both of our countries are exhibiting under threat. It's still, the United States is still the bastion of freedom that we need to hope can battle these untruths. This weekend we had a famous American, Charlie Munger, who decided it was his turn to bash Bitcoin, and he's wrong, and he's also conflicted. He's 90 something years old. Unfortunately, though, he's influencing people that think he knows what he's talking about. I have a feeling he knows he's not telling the truth, but he is so conflicted with the amount of financial equity he owns from the fiat Ponzi that he can't possibly call out the fiat Ponzi like he knows exists, right? It would be shitting where you eat. And, so he decides, okay, I'm going to align with the Federal Reserve and say that Bitcoin is evil because it undermines the Federal Reserve. I prefer to flip it on its ear and say the Federal Reserve is the problem and the fiat money is why we are in this problem, and we need to solve the fiat Ponzi. I'm sorry, but Charlie Munger is not someone I would go to for technological advice. Nor do I believe that he is truly as foolish as he is saying. I think he knows the truth and he's just not telling it to the people. Unfortunately, it's going to tarnish his legacy, in my opinion, because when Bitcoin does become the global reserve asset, he will have advised many people not to take a position in it, even a small position, as insurance. And that's all we advocate is get off zero. Don't own zero Bitcoin. You need to own more than zero, and you will actually reduce your overall portfolio risk because it's insurance against the inevitable failing of the fiat system.
It's great advice. And it's basically what I say to everyone else as well. It's just, get some skin in the game. Once you have some skin in the game, you start to take a bit more interest in what's actually going on. And with someone like Charlie Munger, it, like a lot of things that seemingly happened in the last 24 months, as soon as you start peeling the story back a little and you start looking at incentive structures underneath the narrative, then the narrative falls to pieces. And you go, well, hang on, what does this guy, who is this guy? How does he benefit from these statements? And you realize that his financial wealth is based on how the status quo functions. And therefore, why on earth would he promote an innovative and nascent technology that actually potentially displaces a lot of and disrupts a lot of these business models he's been so successful with? And yeah, it's when you ask those questions that things do become a little clearer. Greg, what I'd love to do is head back to 2016.
Yes.
And just say, share as much or as little as you want, but the stress and strain of the line of work that you found yourself in, you obviously
Yeah.
enjoyed, you became super competitive and successful at, very nearly, meant you weren't here today to tell the tale.
Yeah.
What happened, and how did that make you feel? And I love, and this seems to come across a lot, to be honest, is people are down and out and they
Mhm.
somehow go, fuck it, I'm going to survive. And they pull themselves together and then they move forwards. Just take me through that journey a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for asking. So it was obviously very a horrible time in my life. Life is beautiful, but when you don't feel like participating in it, and you have three kids who are counting on you to pull through, you better get your shit together. Or if you don't, and unfortunately, lots of people don't, and they don't survive. In 2016, I was wrestling with three specific events, of which I only had control over one of them. I had a very stressful job. Okay, I could control that by quitting my job, which I did. But here's the thing. When you quit a job that you're very proud of and you earn a lot of money at that job, and all of a sudden you're not earning the same amount of money, and people ask you what you're doing, and you're like, well, I'm retired. And they look at you and like, but you're 50 years old. And yeah, I'm 50. And then they say, but okay, are you sure you want to be retired? And you're like, I think I know I can't survive in this job, but I don't really want to be retired. Anyway, that was one of the things I could control. I took command of it and I did quit, but it didn't solve even that trigger, because then all of a sudden you're unemployed and you're like, now what am I supposed to do in life? Anyway, you don't have something as pride called a job. But the other two things where I was not in control, one of them was my son's hockey career, which in North America, hockey is a big game. He was played top-notch hockey. He had a chance to be drafted into the NHL. He had all these opportunities, and it was a bit of a volatile career with good opportunities and then get injured, and then get invited to the NHL combine but don't get drafted. Anyway, it goes like this, which is fine, but I couldn't control it. But let me tell you, as a former competitive sports guy, you're very proud of your son and you're living vicariously through him, but also
Yeah,
you're
hell yeah.
winning the wins and losses, right? So anyway, there was that. And then both of my parents died in very short succession. And they were in Montreal. I was living in Toronto, because that's where the trading, the heart of the trading financial markets is, in Toronto, in Canada. And it's only about a 500-kilometer distance between the two, but it's not like I lived next door. And I was the oldest guy in the family, and I had to take care of the estate and everything like that. And it was actually the house that my granddad built, and there was two generations of stuff that we had to clear out of the house. Anyway, those three things in conjunction led me to a breaking point. And it's also that my adrenal system had been beaten up after so many years in the pits, right? And I wasn't always taking great care of myself. Traders tend to drink a lot, stay up late, get up early, go through some crazy days at work. Everything's amazing when markets are going in your favor, but when you have a shitty position that's going against you, it doesn't turn around overnight, and it actually impacts your life meaningfully for a long period of time. It's not uncommon for you to be in a slump for a 300, 400-day period, and it impacts your life. So yeah, it was tough. And but then here's some of the good part. If I can flip it, if you have more questions, go
Well, I was
ahead.
just going to say, can you remember a specific moment or day when you're like, whoa, this is the low point?
Yeah, yes and no. It was a combination of things. My three kids were bent out of shape sideways about my situation, including my youngest child is my daughter, who at that time would have been right around 16 years old, because she was born in the year 2000. And I still remember her coming in and begging with me, Dad, you cannot leave us. Okay. I need you. I'm going to do anything I can to support you. And she wrote me this beautiful poem and stuff like that. Right.
Wow.
And you're like, holy shit. Okay. And you're like, I cannot let this fucking thing win. I cannot let this disease take me over. I need to survive for my children. So but that being said, it's not an immediate time, Jake. It's like, it's a bottoming process, right? And then you need some things to go positive in your life, because, you get hit with these negative. All you need to do is stabilize. And then, you go to therapy. I was doing some therapy, and yeah, man, listen, but I'm open about it. I was on stage in Miami, and at the Bitcoin conference, and it wasn't planned that I was going to mention it, but I ended up mentioning it. And the feedback I've had from my presentation in Miami is at least equal. People commenting on my panel with 4 billionaires, and other people reaching out and saying, dude, thank you for being honest about your struggles. I've struggled myself. And, in my parents' generation, it was difficult for my parents to admit they had their problems. Both of my parents, in hindsight, had individual mental health challenges. My dad was extremely anxious. My mom was actually manic depressive. She doesn't go out there and advertise it to people, though, right? I've seen her bawling her eyes out in a cycle 4 times. I think it was 3 or 4 times in her life that she had hit the depths of her despair. But these get passed on to their kids. Genetics is what genetics are. And so look, our society is more forgiving now. And I'm not embarrassed about it. I'm not proud of it. But the last thing I should do is be embarrassed of it, because it's like anybody else. If you get a health issue, do you blame someone for getting a health issue that they have no control over? You try not to anyway. Honestly, it was part of my recovery. There's no question, was due to the hope that Bitcoin gave me, that the world that I had participated and made a good living at actually can be changed. And I'm not going to die like Charlie Munger, who's going to go to his grave talking about the fiat Ponzi that he actually exploited from his position. I'm trying to give a solution to the children of the future. Okay, Charlie Munger, yes, he's a great American looking backwards, but as far as I'm concerned, looking forwards, he's not that great American. I need to call him out again, because what he said over the weekend about Bitcoin being evil is absolute balderdash. In fact, the system that's evil is the fiat system that enriches the people at the top of the privilege spectrum and actually hurts the people that are less privileged. Okay, the closer you are to the money printer, i.e. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, the more rewarded you will get when the Fed continues to print money.
Thank you for sharing such a personal journey. And it's amazing the way that people react to the situations around them. Think different things happen, right? So you didn't know that your daughter was going to come and say those things to you. You didn't know. Yes. There's probably a number of other members of your family and moments that you went through that helped. I use the phrase "stop the rot." A sports team can be doing terrible, right? And they cannot win a game, and then just suddenly they get a draw away from home at the top team in the league, and you're like, whoa, what happened there? And then just suddenly, like, things can slowly change, can't they?
Oh yeah.
And you think, whoa, how powerful is that? Because for some reason on that day, everyone was on their game, and that counts as a victory in comparison to what had been the previous 6 to 12 months or maybe longer.
Correct.
And okay, so Bitcoin comes along and you go, hang on a second, this is interesting. Did you see, because some people say they came across Bitcoin and it made them realize how fucked the current system actually is.
Okay.
Or were you actually very much aware, and this is how it comes across, that the system is wrong? Not wrong. The system is failing the average person and enriching the part at the top, and it's just going to carry on forever.
Or not. That's the key. Like, I didn't think it would carry on forever, because I know that fiat's fail ultimately.
Correct.
Now,
Yes. Okay.
we are in the privileged nations, but all you have to do is look to some of the less privileged nations, the Venezuelas of the world, where they actually shovel the currency to the sidewalk because it's worth zero, right?
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So in this instance, then your experience to date had led you to the conclusion that the fiat system had huge issues and at some stage would more than likely fail. And along
Correct.
comes Bitcoin. You're like, oh, hang on, this makes sense.
Yes, no, but
No.
no. When I
So
first looked
talk
at
to me a bit
Bitcoin,
about
yeah, that's
because what I'm
important.
intrigued by, so you've got this lens on the world, and then something
Yeah.
else comes along, and you go, oh, does that make sense? And probably the first time you looked at it, you're like, this is crazy. This doesn't work. So talk to me a
Well,
little bit about that initial kind of adoption process from your perspective.
sure. Like everyone, I was skeptical because everything I'd read in the newspapers is that it's the Ponzi, right? So I didn't want to replace the current Ponzi with a less proven Ponzi. But I took that at face value because you know what? You go through life being a reader of the Wall Street Journal, and to the point where you religiously read the Wall Street Journal every day. I've whittled my reading of the Wall Street Journal down to about 2 issues a week now, whereas before I used to go cover to cover of the Wall Street Journal
Wow.
and believe everything I read in it. And the typical financial rags are not favorable to Bitcoin, much like Charlie Munger isn't, because why? Well, it's going to disintermediate everything they do. At the end of the day, though, I was like everyone. I was skeptical of it, but luckily I didn't. I became intellectually curious and I did a bit of a deeper dive. But here's the cool thing, Jake. The thing that convinced me of its beauty was watching the blockchain in action on like tradeblock.com. Okay. Watching the mempool and the individual transactions of Bitcoin flash across the screen. And you're like, wait a minute, $4 million just flashed across. And then $27 and then $400. And then, and you're like, every single one of these is a transaction peer to peer. And you're like, this is a living, breathing thing of beauty. And then you go into the characteristics of it. Wait, there's only 21 million. Nobody controls it. I can send monetary energy anywhere in the world and it will settle on chain in 10 minutes. Lightning, of course, layer 2, we know it's instantaneous settlement. Anyway, I'm visual, I'm an engineer, I'm mechanical engineer, so I like to see things moving. I like and this was moving, even though it was digital movement, it was absolutely brilliant as far as I'm concerned. And I was sold. I was like, I am in. The guy that pitched me on it was a gentleman who was trying to start Canada's first closed-end Bitcoin fund to be listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And I helped him raise money to the tune of $2 million to realize his vision and our dream of getting Canada's first listed closed-end Bitcoin fund, which actually turned into the genesis or was the precursor of Canada's exchange-traded actual ETF, Bitcoin ETF. So Canada is a global leader in this space. I'm happy to say I was a partner and a fundraiser to help that dream come true, because it does help Canadians to get exposure to this brilliant asset class.
Wow, that's a pretty cool space to have been, and a good entrepreneurial story. It's interesting how someone like yourself that sat as a trader for so long so easily has transferred to doing kind of entrepreneurial activities. And entrepreneurship, obviously, such a big part of all economies, right? And I love that concept. It's like, well, actually, you've got a ton of complementary skills that you jump into this space and boom, you can connect this person with this person. And, with the pedigree on your CV, people are going to answer the phone call and blah, 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 and in you go. What I'm intrigued by, Greg, is I'm not an engineer. And one of the things that I have always done in my lifetime is look to more technical people to help understand opportunities. And as I mentioned, I worked in startups for a few years, and I had a number of friends who were, co-founders of things that didn't work out, that were software developers, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
What is it about your engineering degree and engineering background that helped you see the value in Bitcoin? So, as an engineer, you can look at this thing and say, this works. And someone who's a non-engineer will look at it and be like, it's a cool technology, but I don't understand how it works.
So,
and so I like to kind of leverage my own conviction off other people's skill sets in that sense.
okay, great question. So firstly, I need to be clear. I know what I know and I know what I don't know. Okay. There was a time when I was a pretty good coder, but you know, being a coder in BASIC 1, 2, 3 or in Fortran or those mainframe applications, and then translating that into Lotus 1, 2, 3, and then into you know, other spreadsheet analysis, or it doesn't really matter whether, you know, data, it's DBase or whatever. The truth is, you need to understand a certain level of coding, but I'll never be a blockchain coder. I'll leave that to the experts. So I know what I know, I know what I don't know. What I am is not a mechanical engineer anymore. I'm a financial engineer. I'm comfortable with mathematics. I'm not the world's greatest mathematician, but you don't have to be. You just have to know various things. You have to be able to combine risk management. You have to be able to combine discipline. When you're trading a book, you cannot feel that you are bigger than the market. As soon as you feel you're bigger than the market, that is a method to blow yourself up. That comes from things like playing sports, discipline, living within your own rules of risk management. So I need to run through to you why I think Bitcoin is the best asymmetric return opportunity I've ever seen.
And I was going to return to that from the start of the conversation.
Okay, so good, because we're bumping up against our time limit. I'm not kicking you off. You don't have to kick me off if you don't want to, but here's what I know. Okay, I always approach things from an engineering perspective. I like to think of the macro before I think of the micro.
Yeah.
So,
Greg, just quickly, we can go as long as we want. It's not a big deal.
Okay, good. Okay, so here's what I know.
Keep powering through whilst it's compelling, because I'm loving all of this. No worries.
All right, brother. Okay, so I look at things from the macro view, and I said, okay, I love Bitcoin, the ability to transfer monetary energy. So first of all, get yourself a wallet and experience the beauty of transferring monetary energy to another place in the world. And one of the places I did transfer $700 US equivalent of Bitcoin was to an indigenous tribe in New Zealand that was trying to raise money. And if I had tried to send that transaction through the current wire or SWIFT system, it never would have settled. Okay, they would have accused the indigenous tribe of being some sort of money laundering or nefarious organization on the other side of the world. And even though it's my money, we're not going to use the SWIFT payment rails to settle that. AML, anti-money laundering, KYC, all this bullshit. It's not bullshit, but you know, the way they restrict you. So anyway, I experienced the beauty of sending this monetary energy to New Zealand. It settled in 10 minutes. If they had actually let you do it through the SWIFT system, it would have taken 7 days. And as I said, it was unlikely to settle, but if it had, it would have taken 7 days. Okay, wow, this is a cool technology. Then let's look at how big an opportunity Bitcoin could be. So I broke everything down. I went to the Institute of International Finance and I got the value of total financial assets in the world using 2018 numbers. The total value of financial assets in the world, US dollar 900 trillion. Okay. And I'll break them down on the top of my head, but 400 trillion is debt. Okay. 300 trillion is global real estate. 100 trillion is global equities. And then the other 100 trillion is everything else. So gold, fine art, commodities, currencies. You got 900 trillion right there. And I'm like, I'm an engineer and I believe that there will be a time where natural resource energy is priced in Bitcoin. Selling natural resource energy for petrodollar, fiat, US dollar based is stupid. You're selling a valuable commodity, which creates energy for a piece of paper that the US dollar or the US government can print, okay? The US government can actually print oil. When you think about it, that is what one of their strategic advantages is in the world. They can print oil, whereas every other country has to pay for oil. Or in the case of Canada, we have it as a natural resource. At the end of the day, though, we're getting US dollar fiat for our valuable resources. That's not a great trade. And I think there will be a time where global natural resource energy, oil and natural gas, is priced in Bitcoin. It will start with a company like Russia. I mean, when I said this back in 2018, and I actually wrote a paper on this subject, why every fixed income portfolio needs to own Bitcoin as portfolio insurance. I hypothesized that Bitcoin could become the world reserve asset, okay? Replacing US treasuries as the store of value that people want. And that comes, there's a number of avenues to get there, but certainly one of them is, replacing the US dollar as the petrodollar. So nonetheless, let's play some probability analysis. What happens if Bitcoin were to capture 5% of global financial assets? Let's run through the math. 5% of 900 trillion is 45 trillion. $45 trillion divided by 21 million Bitcoins, which is the protocol, the math and code that defends the scarcity of Bitcoin, is over 2 million US dollars per Bitcoin in today's dollars. In fact, in 2018 dollars, but let's just say in today's dollars. Holy moly. That's at a 5% market share of the total global financial assets. What if it becomes the world reserve assets? I anticipate that it'll be far higher than just 5% of total global assets, but let's start with that. That's a $2 million price target. And it's a price target. It's not a limit, okay? But as a probability player, every trade I do, I try and back out the probabilities that this would happen in the market. And one of the simplest ways of doing that is taking the current price of Bitcoin, to make the math easy, 40,000, and dividing it by the 2 million price target I have. And that gives you the market's probability that you are correct. Okay, so 40,000 divided by 2 million is 1/50, is essentially a 2% probability that my price target is correct. Now, what I do is I say, okay, I'm admittedly not 100% certain I'm going to be right, but man, oh man, am I higher than 2% probability. So ship it in, and any of your idiot friends who debate that mathematics, have fun staying poor, you knuckleheads, okay? Do math. Math is the base layer of language. Math makes the world work. This is probability analysis, but understand that it starts with mathematics and you have to play a game of probability. So what if you asked me on this show, what is my probability? And I was able to be finagled into giving you an answer of it's at least 40%. Well, what's 40% of 2 million is 800,000 US dollars per Bitcoin. In other words, until it trades for that price, I should be a buyer of Bitcoin. Okay, 40% of 2 million, 800,000. And as information changes and it becomes more likely that Bitcoin will succeed in terms of things like adoption, in terms of countries adopting Bitcoin, in terms of a country asking for payment of their natural resource energy in Bitcoin. As an engineer, the law of conservation of energy is very near and dear to my heart. So it makes sense that you should get paid for natural resource energy in Bitcoin rather than worthless fiat petrodollars. Anyway, all these things add up to this is the best asymmetric trade I've ever seen in my life. I can't tell you that Bitcoin is going to go directly to 2 million, but I can also tell you I want to be on the side of the trade that'll participate in that price appreciation. And if you own 0 Bitcoin, you are taking far more risk than someone who's done the research and has an appropriate portfolio allocation. And all I can say to your friends is, if you own 0 Bitcoin, you're taking far more risk than somebody who owns, let's say, 5% of their net worth in Bitcoin.
Such an interesting point. Well, Greg, thank you so much for walking me through that. It's a really nice example as to why we're so excited about this asset class. I mean, you've got 30 years of experience of placing investments essentially, or looking at trades, and this is the best you want. This is the best one you've ever seen, like hands down fact.
Yes.
Well, Greg, we're coming towards the end, so I'd just like to
Sure.
come to the present day and say, first and foremost, thank you so much for all the work you do in the Bitcoin space, teaching us about the way you view it and why it's so important. And if there weren't more people like you around, I wouldn't understand it nearly as well as I do. So thank you very much. Looking forwards, you touched on at the start of the conversation that you're involved in a Bitcoin mining project. You're obviously doing lots of podcasts, but equally, you don't want to be in a position where you feel like you're working for someone. So what does the next kind of 5-10 years have in store for you?
I want to help make the world a better place for people that are less privileged than I am. I actually want to help secure the future for my children. I'm not a philanthropist per se, but I'm trying to share the knowledge that I've accumulated in what I think is a very unique career. I
mean, so just to jump in there, Greg, you don't, it's cool in that actually you don't need to be a philanthropist to have an impact, right?
Correct.
I love the phrase my mate Jigs uses, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish, he feeds his family for life.
Yeah.
And this phrase, it's kind of exactly what you're doing here by sharing people the information that you have and the opinions that you hold based on the experience you have. We don't need philanthropists, right? The punter on the street can buy a bit of Bitcoin, deflationary asset, grows in value over time in terms of purchasing power, and they can help to feed their families, educate their kids, live a better life, right? Fucking bring it on. That's kind of what philanthropy is all about, in a sense, is empowering people. So to my mind, this is an awesome kind of iteration of the free market in a sense, and the ability to give people give them the tools to go and do it themselves, rather than I need to wait for my my donor to give us some money before we can fund anything type thing. So I think it's a really cool iteration of it.
Well, thanks. And on that basis, I want to make sure that I give kudos to Looking Glass Education again, because Looking Glass has made a donation to the education in El Salvador of young high school students in El Salvador, that many of them are challenged between choosing to stay in school and the local gangs that try and recruit the kids at about that age. And having boots on the ground experience, I haven't seen it myself, but one of my business partners has, and also a business partner at Das Bea. It makes you feel good. Now, there's so much more we could be doing, but at least it's a start. So our education platform is going to be translated into Spanish, for example, so that they can get information that they wouldn't. It's certainly in North America, no one gets taught this thing, because I think I said it. I've had so many podcasts. This is my third one today, by the way, my third podcast today. So I can't remember what I said to you, but to make sure I get the point across, they can't teach you what we have on Looking Glass Education in high school, because if they did, no one would put their money into banks, because they'd realize the true risk they are taking, right? And then they say, well, yeah, don't worry, the government will bail out the banks are too big to fail, which is true, but it just, accelerates the debt spiral of our current financial system. So education is key. My experience is pretty unique, as I've tried to mention. I love meeting the people in this community. I believe Bitcoiners are some of the most generous people in terms of their time, in terms of their energy. The Bitcoin conference in Miami, I met some incredibly good people, and the whole time, including being on stage with four billionaires, different people, but there was me and 4 billionaires. None of these people ever talked about price per se. They talked about the vision of making the world a better place. And that basically is a common theme within Bitcoiners of all walks of life, levels of, age levels, cultures, etc. They want to help make the world a better place, because our current politicians have absolutely, taken advantage of it so much. I want to get in power for the next 4 years. So why don't I just give everybody some money that will make them feel like I'm enriching them, and then they'll vote for me in the next election, right? What a crock. But this is certainly what our local prime minister did. And from what I hear about Australia, there's some misgivings about that person down there as well, and potentially their links to things like the World Economic Forum.
Yeah.
This is dangerous stuff. I never thought I would be saying this, but all you got to do is peel a layer of the onion. And coming right back to Charlie Munger, it was him who said, show me an incentive and I'll show you a person's direction. Well, he's absolutely incented not to show that Bitcoin can disintermediate his fiat Ponzi. So he obviously calls Bitcoin evil because he knows that it will destroy legacy traditional finance. Okay. It's so over for Western Union. Like, I don't even know why that company still has a $6 billion market cap. As a former hedge fund guy, I would be so short that piece of, basically legalized extortion where they charge remittance fees that are just absolute egregious 20% fees. You got to short that stock, and it's too late. They're the blockbuster of the financial payment rail system. But don't overlook things like Visa and MasterCard. And here's a final thing, and maybe we'll end on this. Okay. Sure. So I'm one of the things I've done, and you mentioned, you were an angel investor. I'm have always had a knack for the entrepreneurial side. And in fact, one of my good friends in Montreal 30 years ago started one Irish pub in Montreal and asked for an investor. And I said I would help him, and I invested with him. And now we have 8 of them, okay, 30 years later, in 8 Irish pubs in Montreal. But here's the reality. Irish pubs are a shit business, okay? If you have $1 of revenue and you're a really good Irish pub, you're probably making around 14 cents of after-tax cash flow, or, I should say even pre-tax cash flow, called EBITDA. EBITDA on your dollar. So you have a 14% EBITDA margin. And that's if you're a good restaurateur. And if someone pulls out their credit card to pay us at a restaurant, our operating margin goes from 14 cents. The credit card company charges 2.5% as a merchant fee. Our 14% goes down to 11.5%, right? Because someone pays with a credit card, we have to take and pay 2.5% merchant fees on that. That's a pretty excessive, or not excessive, but it's costly, that you don't want people to pay with a credit card. But let's take it one step further. In third world countries, and El Salvador in particular, you know what merchant fees are when someone uses a credit card? 8%. 8. So if you're a really good restaurant in El Salvador and you have a 14% profit margin, pre-tax cash flow, and someone pays with a credit card, your profitability goes down to 6 cents on the dollar from 14. Holy moly. Don't you have an incentive to ask people not to pay with a credit card? And this is why the Lightning Network, remittances, everything that's happening in El Salvador can help increase the GDP of that country so meaningfully. And it's not a straight line up, but another investment I made is in a young group of guys, Spanish guys. They started in Guatemala, and I met them a year ago at the conference in Miami 1 year ago. And they had an idea to do something in Guatemala. And I said, guys, tell me a bit about your story. And they taught me about the Lightning Network, and I said, okay, I'm going to make an investment. And it was basically it was a significant amount of money for me, but it was more of a token investment to try and encourage these guys, because they went from Guatemala to going to El Salvador, which is a 3-hour drive away, and becoming the merchant solution in El Salvador for the Lightning Network. And they have since taken that technology and they've onboarded the city of Miami. Okay. So in 1 year, these kids from Guatemala went to El Salvador, and then now in Miami. And no disrespect to El Salvador, but the GDP of the greater Miami area is way bigger than the entire country of El Salvador. Okay. So the opportunity in Miami for IBEX Mercado has just gone parabolic. And I'm an angel investor in that company. And at Miami Bitcoin conference this year, they had one of the best and largest expositions on the floor. And it was less than 400 days prior that I had met these guys. And
Wow.
this is the speed at which things move in the Bitcoin community.
Wow.
And I couldn't be more proud of them for helping to change the lives of people in South America that are otherwise much less privileged than us, and much more in danger of going, of pursuing a path of gangs and etc. So this is stuff that I really do think changed the world, Jake. It's not a straight line, but I want to be part of it. I want to support it as I can. And the people that I've met in this community, it's a pleasure to meet you. Guys like Jeff Booth that I've only known for maybe 20 months. I feel like I've known him for at least 20 years. And this community is full of really, really cool people, and people who are motivated to do good.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? The people that you meet. Oh, well, Greg, this has been a wonderful story. I couldn't be more thankful for your time and sharing all of the information that you have. To your point, we'll wrap it up there. Last question is, where can people get hold of you if they want to get in touch?
Sure. I am, strangely enough, on Twitter, and I actually have a following that I'm very thankful that people care what I have to say. So Twitter is probably my best spot.
Cool.
My Twitter handle is Foss, Greg Foss. So at FOSSGREGFOSS. I mentioned that I'm a partner at LookingGlassEducation.com. Follow at LookingGlassEDU is the Twitter handle for Looking Glass Education, but again, Looking Glass EDU is the Twitter handle. The guys that I'm working with, which includes your friend Daz Bea, I'm so proud to be part of that. And our youngest guy on that team is in his low 20s. Our oldest guy is me in his old 50s, and we make a pretty good team. And I'm just looking forward to helping to provide my experience. I've seen some stuff that you guys would never believe. And when I say in March of 2009, that the world was on the precipice of absolutely imploding, don't take that lightly, okay? And that could happen very quickly again. Fiat is programmed to debase. That is exactly the mathematical certainty of it. You are very rarely 100% certain of any investment or anything out there. Mathematically, it is 100% certain that fiat money will continue to debase at an accelerated basis. It's just credit metrics where I've spent my whole life. You got to protect yourself against that certainty. It is a certainty that it's happening. You tell me how you're protecting yourself against it. One of the best ways, in my opinion, the best way, but you don't need to be 100% in, is to own Bitcoin.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Greg. I commented before the call that I was obsessed with Bitcoin, and you mentioned that you weren't quite in the obsessed category. Perhaps we need a new definition for what obsessed actually is, because I feel there's a lot of overlap there between the two of us and the passion for this this new thing. It's, as you mentioned, a living kind of existing thing, and the mempool is all just ticking away.
Thing, it's just crazy. It's a living thing, and it's beautiful.
Sorry, well, Greg, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, buddy. Keep up the good work. And, you're young, you're going to make a huge impact on this world. We need motivated people to stick with the commitment. Current Bitcoin price is a better investment today than it is when I got involved with it in 2016 at under $1,000 US per Bitcoin. Why? Very simply, because the world went through COVID and the certainty of fiat debasement is now unquestionable. It is 100% certain because of what the governments have done by printing so much money and adding to our deficit, accumulated deficit. We cannot escape the DEBT spiral. Take and protect your children's future monetary energy or what you plan to transfer to them. We can have a lot more conversations about things like central bank digital currencies and all this other stuff. Perhaps that's for another time. Thanks for having me. Good night from Canada. I think it's good morning in Aussie now.
20 past 10 in the morning here in Melbourne.
You guys have a great day. And someday, we'll look back on this in 20 years and we'll say, you remember when Bitcoin was, $40,000? Yeah, you just have to take advantage of these opportunities, increase or decrease your, lower your time preference. I like to say to people, let's talk in 20 years. Okay. So thank you very much. And good morning, Australia. Good night, Canada, and everyone in between.
Take care, Greg. Thank you so much.
Thank you, buddy.